Inside a nationally televised congressional showdown in Washington, D.C., Representative Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Martin Shkreli, the convicted pharma tycoon who once priced a single pill at $750. He tries to lecture the chamber on free market logic, but just minutes later, Crockett detonates the room with a secret prison recording and proof of a fake company he still controls. His empire collapses on live TV, his allies abandon him mid-hearing, and federal prosecutors move in. What did Jasmine reveal that turned Wall Street's coldest villain into a national disgrace before the cameras even stopped rolling? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. U.S. Capitol, March 2026. The rotunda echoed with restless murmurs as camera lenses narrowed in on room 2141, where a single name was written on every tongue: Jasmine Crockett. Appointed chair of the most anticipated congressional hearing in a decade, she sat at the center of a storm that had been brewing for years. Across the country, more than 40 million Americans watched live, many clutching their prescription bottles like lifelines, waiting for justice, retribution, or at least an answer to why life-saving medications cost more than life itself. The hearing was titled Restructuring Big Pharma After the Pandemic, but it might as well have been named The Reckoning. Every chair was filled, security was doubled, reporters were stationed shoulder to shoulder, and the room carried the silent weight of lives lost, families bankrupted, futures delayed, all while pharmaceutical stocks soared. And then, the doors opened. Martin Shkreli stepped in. He walked like he never left. Black suit, silver tie, smug smirk, the kind that had once made him the face of greed in modern medicine. But this time, he wasn't the puppet master. He was the defendant. Fresh out of prison, summoned for his new role as CEO of a shadowy biotech startup, already accused of manipulating AI-driven insurance algorithms to deny coverage for experimental cancer treatments. His new company had tripled insulin prices within a month and buried the data behind firewalls coded to exploit Medicaid loopholes. But today, those firewalls were cracking. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise from her seat. She didn't have to. The gavel in her hand was heavier than before, not just by metal, but by the burden of every American family shattered by profit-driven pills. She looked up slowly, her eyes locked with Shkreli's, and with a single line, she detonated the silence. Mr. Shkreli, did you learn anything at all from the prison cell you walked out of? Or did you just build a new one, this time for the rest of us? The room froze. The chamber held its breath, waiting for shame or remorse. But Shkreli didn't flinch. He smiled and walked straight into the fire like he lit it himself. If Jasmine Crockett's question pierced the silence like a blade, Shkreli responded not with regret, but with a rehearsed smile, a clicker in hand, and a presentation titled like a warning, The Free Market, Why It Must Hurt to Heal. He strode to the center like a lecturer preparing to enlighten the misinformed. Behind him, a screen lit up with a minimalist slide, stark white letters on black, reading $750 is not a crime. The boldness of it felt like a slap to every struggling parent watching from a hospital waiting room. He didn't even glance at the panel. He was performing, for the cameras, for the markets, maybe even for himself. Let's be clear, he began, adjusting the microphone with a calmness that made it worse. If someone pays $750 for a drug, it means the drug has value. It means they wanted it. That's not extortion. That's economics. The words hung in the air like smoke after a controlled burn. Clean, technical, detached from the charred remains beneath. He clicked to the next slide, a chart tracking supposed R&D investment growth alongside increasing drug prices. But there were no patient names. No mention of the 7-year-old diabetic whose mother started a GoFundMe at midnight. No asterisks for the elderly man who'd cut pills in half to stretch a prescription. Just graphs, numbers, and margins. Without profit, he said coolly, there is no progress. You can't demand a cure for cancer and also demand socialism. Someone has to pay the bill. He paused, let the silence stretch, then added with deliberate disdain, and let's not pretend the problem is us. The real issue is a generation raised to expect rescue. From government checks, from subsidies, from bailouts. The welfare system doesn't empower people. It erodes them. A slow stir moved through the chamber. Crockett didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't need to. The room was already starting to pulse with something raw. Because what Shkreli was offering wasn't just a defense. It was an ideology that traded human suffering for financial sustainability. He called it innovation. But to the millions watching live, millions who'd skipped treatments, drained savings, buried loved ones, it felt more like a confession without the guilt. He wasn't hiding it. He was daring the world to accept it. And for Jasmine Crockett, seated in the eye of that storm, it was clear. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a moral crucible. Shkreli's final word landed like a stone in still water, smug, polished, and deeply hollow. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She understood something he didn't. Real power doesn't rush. It waits. She didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, she let the room sit in the echo of his last sentence, watching him with the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen this game before, played by different men in different suits, but always with the same cruelty wrapped in confidence. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, but her body remained still, grounded, controlled. It wasn't silence born of uncertainty. It was strategy, because she knew something was unfolding, and the more he talked, the more he revealed. She didn't need to attack. She needed him to keep digging. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the stillness like a scalpel. "Mr. Shkreli," she said slowly, "before we go any further, could you define for this committee what ethics means in the context of pharmaceutical practice?" She emphasized the word ethics, not market value, not return on investment. Ethics. And in that moment, the power shifted. Not because she shouted, but because she reminded everyone in the room. This was never just about numbers. It was about who we are when profit meets pain. Outside the Capitol, the air was electric. Protesters, some hoarse from chanting, others silent in grim solidarity, lined the barricades. They held signs like shields. Justice over profit. Insulin is not a luxury. Patience, not price tags. Some were parents, some were patients. Many had lost someone. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were pleading. Pleading with a system that had failed them too many times to count. Every word said in that hearing was being broadcast in real time to a public that no longer trusted the institutions designed to protect them. They weren't asking for handouts. They were asking for humanity. And inside the chamber, Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, deliberate, was doing something rare in American politics. She was listening, not to power, but to pain. Shkreli began to respond, his mouth opening with the ease of a man used to deflecting truth. But Jasmine Crockett didn't let him finish. She raised her hand, calm and precise, and said only one sentence. "We're going to let the country decide what ethics looks like." The lights dimmed. The screen behind her lit up, not with graphs or slogans, but with a single unpolished video clip. No dramatic music, no narration, just a boy. His name was Elijah. He was 13. His hospital gown hung loose around his shoulders. A nasal cannula fed oxygen through his nose. He spoke in broken breaths, his voice barely audible. "They told us, there's a pill," he said, pausing to breathe, "but we don't have that kind of money." The camera panned slightly. His mother was beside him, holding his hand with the quiet desperation of someone who's already begged every hotline, every nonprofit, every elected office she could reach. "They said Daraprim used to be $20, she said, eyes locked on the camera. "But after the price change, it was hundreds per pill." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her stillness was more devastating than any scream. The clip lasted less than a minute. When the screen went black, the silence it left behind felt heavier than any testimony that had come before it. No one moved, no one dared. Even the cameras, usually quick to scan the room, stayed fixed on Jasmine. She turned slowly towards Shkreli, her face unreadable, but her voice unwavering. "That," she said, "is what the market calls efficiency." Her words were sharp but controlled, not theatrical, not angry, just devastating in their truth. "You called it innovation. You called it strategy. But what I see is a child who was priced out of his own life." Across the room, lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down. Others looked directly at Shkreli, who sat frozen. the smugness now drained into something closer to shame, or perhaps fear. Because for the first time, the numbers he had worshipped were no longer on a spreadsheet. They had a face, a name, a heartbeat. And that heartbeat was fading because of him. As the last haunting image of Elijah dissolved into darkness, the silence that followed didn't feel like the end of a clip. It felt like a room gasping for breath. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move to comfort. She moved to confront. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for theatrics. Instead, with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision, she opened the black folder resting beside her gavel. Her fingers moved slowly, methodically, pulling out a single printed email, a plain sheet of paper but heavy with something far more damning than any chart Shkreli had shown. This, she began, lifting the document just enough for the camera to catch, is an internal email from Mr. Shkreli's company, dated 3 weeks after the price increase on Daraprim. Her voice was calm, but the courtroom leaned forward instinctively, as if preparing for impact. Then she read it aloud, slowly, clearly. "Let's milk this one. They have no choice." The words didn't land like a bomb. They landed like a betrayal. A quiet, brutal kind. The kind you feel in the gut, not the ears. They, she repeated, gaze fixed on Shkreli, being patients with compromised immune systems. Children, the dying, people who couldn't survive without that drug. The sentence hung in the air, not as a quote, but as a confession. And your company didn't discuss how to help them. You discussed how to squeeze them, because they couldn't say no. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Because this wasn't just about one executive or one price hike. It was about a system where a child's body could be reduced to a market opportunity. And someone somewhere wrote that sentence with no hesitation. Around the room, even the most hardened political veterans shifted in their seats. A few lowered their eyes. The phrase repeated itself silently across every mind in the chamber. They have no choice. It was not strategy. It was exploitation, laid out in plain text. And Jasmine didn't move on quickly. She let it breathe, let it burn. Because this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about translating suffering into language that could no longer be ignored. The words from the email, "They have no choice," still hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Jasmine set the page down gently, letting the silence stretch. Not as a pause, but as a judgment. And into that silence, Martin Shkreli spoke. It was quiet, so quiet you could hear a pen drop in the back row. No gavel struck. No one dared breathe too loudly. The entire hearing room, packed with lawmakers, aides, press, and history itself, had become still. And then, in a moment that would be replayed across news networks and social media for weeks, Martin Shkreli smirked. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low and disturbingly calm. "That's business," he said. Just 2 words. But in those 2 words was everything that had gone wrong. Everything millions of Americans already feared, but had never heard said aloud. Not with this level of contempt, not in this place. He wasn't denying the accusation. He was validating it. The boy who couldn't breathe, the mother who couldn't pay. To him, they weren't tragedies. They were transactions. A few gasps broke through the silence. One senator's hand dropped from his face as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. A reporter in the back lowered her camera, stunned. But Jasmine didn't react. Not with shock, not with rage. She sat completely still, staring straight at him, her expression carved from something colder than anger. Clarity. Because in that moment, she understood, and everyone else did too, that this wasn't about one man. It wasn't about one drug, one scandal, or even one broken company. It was about a culture, a system, one that had allowed profit to become so normalized, so sacred that a child's death could be dismissed as just another entry in a ledger. And now the man who helped design it had said the quiet part out loud, not by accident, by instinct. Because to him, ethics had no margin, only profit did. Shkreli's words, "That's business," still echoed in the chamber like a threat dressed in a shrug. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look shocked. She looked ready. And when she spoke, the air changed. She leaned forward, not with fury, but with clarity, the kind that doesn't rise to meet arrogance, but cuts straight through it. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise, but every syllable was made of steel. Economic freedom, she said slowly, deliberately, does not mean strangling the poor to make the rich richer. The line didn't echo. It landed. Heavy, final. You could feel it in the room, the shift from theater to reckoning. Lawmakers sat straighter. Reporters dropped their pens. The audience outside, watching on massive screens, erupted into stunned silence. You say that's business like it's a shield, she continued, eyes locked on Shkreli now. But when your business model is built on people who can't say no, when it depends on a mother choosing between medicine and groceries, that's not innovation. It's extortion. Her voice tightened, not with anger, but with something deeper. Conviction born from seeing this cruelty up close. She didn't need charts. She didn't need applause. She had one weapon, the truth spoken plainly. What you call capitalism, she said, has become a system of quiet violence, where those who suffer the most are told they should be grateful the market noticed them at all. She paused just long enough to let that truth settle. Shkreli said nothing. His smirk was gone, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was accountability. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to argue price points. She came to draw a line between policy and morality, and to say without blinking that some lines are not meant to be crossed in the name of profit. Not now. Not ever. The chamber was still reeling from Jasmine Crockett's last statement, a silence loaded with truth, too sharp to ignore. But Martin Shkreli, as always, mistook the stillness for weakness. And so, he smirked and spoke. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded like a schoolboy caught lying but too proud to care. Why not just give the drugs away for free then? He said, loud enough for the cameras, his tone oozing mockery. Maybe we can all hold hands and heal each other with kindness. A few chuckles, awkward, forced, from the back benches. But the room didn't laugh. It flinched. Because it wasn't just sarcasm, it was contempt. For patients, for families, for the entire hearing itself. The question wasn't genuine. It was a shield, a dare, a tactic used by profiteers when they're no longer able to defend the harm they cause. But Jasmine Crockett had heard it before, from CEOs, from bankers, from lobbyists in more expensive suits. And this time, she wasn't going to let it stand. She sat forward, her tone sharp, not theatrical, but precise. You mean the HIV vaccine you invested in? She asked, locking eyes with him. The room snapped to attention. The one developed by American researchers with taxpayer-funded grants? The one you quietly sold the patent rights for, to a biotech firm with direct ties to Beijing? Her voice didn't rise, but the accusation sliced like cold steel. Let me ask you something, Mr. Shkreli, she continued, letting each word fall with surgical precision. Was that the result of financial hardship? Or was it betrayal disguised as business? Then she said it, flat and clear. Was that poverty or was that treason? A hush swept the room, not from fear, but from recognition. Because this wasn't just about pricing or profit anymore. It was about selling the keys to American breakthroughs to foreign hands while preaching loyalty in the name of capitalism. Shkreli's grin faltered, only slightly, but enough. Enough for the room to feel it. Enough for the public to see through it. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a lawmaker asking a question. She was the voice of a country tired of being told that betrayal is just the cost of doing business. Just when the chamber thought the worst had been revealed, Jasmine Crockett reached beneath her stack of notes and calmly pressed a small button. And with that, the hearing crossed a line it could never return from. A faint hiss emerged from the speakers. Then, unmistakably, his voice. Martin Shkreli. Confident. Unapologetic. The recording was dated just 6 months before his release from prison, but his tone wasn't that of a man reflecting or remorseful. It was triumphant, calculated. They think they've shut me down, he said, laughing, casual like someone boasting at a bar. I'll be back in the game before they even notice. Set up a shell, maybe in Delaware or offshore. Put it in someone else's name. Play it clean on paper. Dirty underneath. That's the game. And I know how to win it. His voice was unguarded, not because he didn't care, but because he was convinced no one would ever hear it. But now 40 million Americans were. Every word broadcast live. Inside the room, it was as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out. Lawmakers leaned in. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. And Shkreli? He sat rigid, no longer smirking. The color in his face dulled, not from shock, but from the sudden realization that he was no longer ahead of the game. Jasmine let the tape continue for a few seconds longer, enough to let him finish describing how dumb it is that people still think names on paper mean anything, and how he had 3 guys at Ivy League schools willing to sign whatever for a few $1,000s. When she hit pause, the silence didn't feel like silence. It felt like judgment. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into a folder and slid out a single sheet, a visual diagram of Helix Biocorp's ownership structure. It looked like a spiderweb of subsidiaries, offshore filings, nominee directors, and borrowed names. But at the center, traced in red ink, was a quiet trust, registered in Wyoming, linked to a dormant foundation, with Martin Shkreli's handwriting on the incorporation papers. It wasn't just circumstantial, it was direct. "This is your company," Jasmine said flatly, holding the document high so the cameras could catch every name. "You said it wasn't. You said you were just consulting. But your voice, your signature, and your money say otherwise. You didn't just break the rules, you rewrote them so no one would notice when you did." The tension in the room snapped like a cable under pressure. One aide dropped a pen. Another congressman quietly whispered to his counsel. And then came the moment no one had expected. Representative Thomas Varnell, a senior Republican known for his vocal defense of deregulated biotech, slowly rose from his seat. His face was pale, unreadable. "Madam Chair," he said, voice steady but low, "in light of the evidence just presented, I am formally withdrawing my statement of support for Helix Biocorp and rescinding my co-sponsorship of House Bill 488. The room reacted not with applause, but awe. Varnell's name had been on biotech fundraising invitations for years, and now, mid-hearing, he had turned his back. For the first time that day, Shkreli looked vulnerable. Not angry, not mocking, but cornered. Everything he had tried to control, through structure, secrecy, manipulation, had unraveled in under 5 minutes. Not because of politics, but because truth, when fully shown, leaves nowhere to hide. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She simply closed her folder, folded her hands, and looked straight ahead. Because in that moment, justice didn't need volume. It needed only the courage to reveal what was hidden and the strength to let it be seen. What began as a hearing had now become something far more powerful, a rupture in the political machinery that could no longer contain the truth. And once that rupture began, it moved like fire. The instant Jasmine Crockett laid out the final piece, the audio, the paper trail, the shell company, the room combusted into motion. What had started as a tightly controlled proceeding turned into a chorus of demands for accountability. Several lawmakers stood at once, voices overlapping with urgency, not chaos. "This needs to go to the DOJ," shouted one. "We need immediate oversight hearings," said another. Others demanded subpoenas, asset freezes, and criminal referrals. Not next week, not after recess, but now. There was no hesitation, no party lines, just an instinctive reaction to the kind of deception too bold to ignore and too systemic to downplay. The committee's legal staff scrambled to document requests as aides rushed from the room, phones pressed to their ears, already coordinating with federal investigators. The entire hearing chamber had shifted from inquiry to action. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't even move. She simply watched the storm unfold, the storm she had triggered with nothing more than the truth. But the shock waves didn't stop at the walls of Capitol Hill. Outside, in real time, a different kind of testimony was taking place. Patients who had once been voiceless were now speaking. Thousands of emails poured into the committee's inbox within the hour, from mothers, doctors, nurses, cancer survivors, and hospice workers. A former AIDS patient from Chicago wrote, "For 10 years, I rationed medication so my son could eat. What you did today finally made me feel seen." A rural physician from Alabama posted a video that went viral within minutes. "I've lost patients not because I failed them, but because the system was designed to." Representative Crockett, thank you for saying what the rest of us can't afford to. Medical boards, advocacy groups, and even conservative healthcare coalitions began issuing public statements. The sentiment was clear. This wasn't political anymore. It was moral. And Jasmine Crockett had just redrawn the line. And then, amid the momentum, Martin Shkreli broke. His posture, once smug and composed, dissolved into something more volatile. He had been sitting in silence for nearly 15 minutes, watching his defenses collapse piece by piece. The tape, the chart, the withdrawal of support from a key Republican ally, all of it left him with nowhere to hide. His hands tightened, his jaw clenched. Then, he slammed his fist against the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot through the chamber. Microphones shook. Conversation stopped. He leaned forward, face flushed, voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "This is a show trial," he spat. "You're not a leader, Crockett. You're a professional manipulator. A populist with a law degree." The words were meant to wound. They came sharp, fast, desperate. "You don't care about justice. You care about headlines. You're a fraud." For a moment, the room went cold. Not because of what he said, but because of what it revealed. Shkreli wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. This wasn't strategy anymore. It was instinct. The instinct of a man watching power slip through his fingers and realizing too late that he'd finally met someone he couldn't outmaneuver. Jasmine didn't rise to meet him. She didn't dignify the attack with a rebuttal. She simply turned her head, slowly, evenly, and looked him dead in the eye. The silence that followed didn't need punctuation. It was final. And in that moment, the entire chamber understood. This wasn't about left or right, profit or loss. It was about the kind of country we choose to be when someone finally dares to expose what we've allowed behind closed doors. After the venom of Shkreli's outburst dissipated, the chamber sat in weighted silence. Not from fear, but from the understanding that something irreversible had just occurred. And Jasmine Crockett rose, not to retaliate, but to deliver the truth with the clarity of someone who'd carried it far too long. She stood with the gravity of someone who understood what this moment truly meant, not just for the people in the room, but for every American watching from hospital beds, kitchen tables, and crowded pharmacies. Her gaze locked on Shkreli, not with hatred, but with the steady precision of justice sharpening its edge. There was no need for theatrics. The silence was her stage, and every word she was about to say had been forged from the years of stories she'd heard. Families ruined, lives lost, dignity stolen in the name of economic theory. She took a breath, not to collect herself, but to control the fire that had burned behind her restraint all morning. And then she said it, not as a soundbite, not as a performance, but as a sentence meant to last long after headlines faded. "Getting rich off other people's desperation isn't innovation," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "It's a licensed form of crime." The weight of the words hung there, real, plain, and undeniable. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to explain, because everyone in that room knew exactly what she meant. Shkreli had wrapped himself in contracts, shell corporations, and clever excuses. But at its core, his business model depended on people being too poor, too sick, or too desperate to fight back. "You didn't invent anything," she continued, her voice steady but deeper now, heavy with truth. "You didn't cure a disease. You just figured out how to trap people inside one and charge them rent." Even the stenographer paused for a split second, the tension so thick it felt physical. "You used paperwork as armor, law firms as cover, and every time someone died waiting for a price to drop, you told yourself it was just the market working." She looked around the room, not at Shkreli now, but at the faces of the lawmakers, the aides, the press. "But there is a difference between what's legal and what's moral," she said, the steel returning to her tone. "And today you've made it clear to the entire country which side of that line you chose." Her hands remained still at her sides. Her eyes never dropped. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Because this wasn't a moment for triumph, it was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had just delivered it. Not in anger, but with the quiet, devastating force of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Jasmine Crockett's final words didn't echo. They detonated. And in the stunned quiet that followed, the wheels of power, long dormant in the face of corporate deceit, finally began to turn. This time they turned fast. Before the hearing had even adjourned, the ripple had become a wave. Reporters were already confirming through unnamed sources that the Department of Justice had reopened its file on Martin Shkreli. Not just on his past convictions, but on Helix Biocorp, its ownership structure, its offshore capital flows, its encrypted servers. By noon, DOJ agents had requested formal transcripts of the hearing. By 2, the House Oversight Committee had received an emergency coordination memo from the Office of White-Collar Crime. The signal was unmistakable. This wasn't political anymore. It was prosecutorial. Jasmine had done more than humiliate a man. She had handed the government a map to the rot he thought he'd buried. And then, as if timed to match the shift in the air, Helix Biocorp's stock froze. Trading halted. Charts flatlined. In less than 7 minutes, billions in projected valuation were reduced to digital stillness. Shareholders stared at frozen tickers, unable to buy, sell, or flee. Investment firms began calling crisis meetings. Quiet warnings turned to public panic. This wasn't just a reputational crisis. It was a systemic freeze, triggered by truth. Behind the scenes, financial regulators combed through filings, cross-checking addresses, nominee directors, and internal memos. At the Securities and Exchange Commission, an emergency task force convened by 3:40 p.m. Eastern. Helix's legal team issued a statement calling the freeze procedural, but the markets weren't buying it, because this time, the lies had faces, audio, and a congressional record. Back in Washington, Jasmine Crockett walked out of room 2141 to a corridor crowded with reporters. Flashes erupted, questions flew, but she didn't speak, not yet. She paused, looked down the hallway lined with cameras and cords, then nodded once to her chief of staff before stepping into a private elevator. This wasn't her victory lap. It was the beginning of something bigger. Across the country, the story was no longer just about Martin Shkreli. It was about a system unmasked, a reckoning decades overdue, and a woman who had dragged corruption into the daylight, armed with facts and a voice that refused to flinch. In New York, the DOJ task force filed a preliminary motion to unseal financial records linked to Helix and its shell subsidiaries. Prosecutors described the evidence presented in Congress as material and compelling. Meanwhile, FBI agents quietly requested federal warrants to access cloud servers and private correspondence. Every firewall Shkreli had built, legal, digital, political, was beginning to collapse. By 6 p.m., news tickers across the country ran a synchronized headline. DOJ reopens case against Shkreli. Helix stock frozen. Investigation expands. Wall Street analysts who had once defended Helix as disruptive biotech were now purging their coverage. And ordinary Americans, the ones who'd watched this entire saga unfold, weren't just commenting. They were remembering. Remembering the pills they couldn't afford, the hospital visits denied, the funerals funded by GoFundMe. And in that memory, anger turned into momentum. Helix's phone lines were jammed. Protesters began gathering outside its Manhattan office before sunset. By the time the CEO, one of the Ivy League names Shkreli had bragged about, stepped outside, he was met with chants, signs, and questions he could no longer avoid. Who really owns you? Where's the research you promised? Did he plan this from prison? Cameras caught the moment he turned back and shut the door behind him. Inside the Capitol, Jasmine returned to her office as dozens of emails flooded in. Messages from doctors, former Helix employees, legal experts offering assistance. One note stood out. It was short. It read, "You didn't just expose a company, you exposed an era. We see you. We're ready." And in that quiet moment, before the storm widened, before the indictments came, Jasmine Crockett sat down, opened her notebook, and began outlining the next bill. because truth alone wasn't enough. The system that allowed this to happen had to be dismantled piece by piece, and she knew exactly where to start. As the Justice Department dismantled the machinery Shkreli had built, the nation turned its eyes back to Capitol Hill, where Jasmine Crockett was already preparing her next move. Because punishment alone wasn't enough. There had to be prevention. There had to be law. It came less than 4 weeks after the hearing that changed everything. The corridors of Congress, once gridlocked by partisanship and pharmaceutical lobbying, now pulsed with urgency. A single-page draft, bold, unflinching, circulated through committees with speed rarely seen in Washington. At its center was a name that had, in the weeks since the scandal, become synonymous with accountability: the Crockett Bill. The text was clear. It capped pharmaceutical price increases at no more than 100% within any 12-month period. No exceptions, no loopholes. Violators would face federal fines, licensing suspensions, and mandatory restitution to patients. Lobbyists scrambled. Industry insiders warned of economic disruption. But the public wasn't listening to them anymore. They were listening to the woman who refused to let business as usual be the language of suffering. On the morning of the vote, the Capitol was packed. Protesters and supporters lined the steps, many holding up empty pill bottles, some holding photos of those they'd lost: parents, siblings, children, faces that had never made it to the hearing, but whose stories lived inside every clause of that bill. Inside, the chamber was electric. Jasmine sat quietly in the front row, the sponsor of a bill written in ink but driven by lived experience. She had been told it would take years. She had been warned it was too ambitious. And yet, here it was, on the floor, in front of the nation, facing a moment no lobby could bury. One by one, members of Congress stood to cast their votes. A few gave short speeches, but most simply nodded, because this wasn't about debate anymore. It was about decency. When the final vote was called, the chamber held still. The clerk read the tally. The Crockett bill had passed, with a bipartisan majority. The room erupted, not with applause, but with something quieter, heavier, a collective exhale. Years of outrage, of helplessness, of empty prescriptions and silent grief had finally pushed through the floor of Congress. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up across the country. And Jasmine Crockett? She stood slowly, nodded once, and quietly left the chamber. Not in triumph, but in fulfillment. The headlines followed within minutes. Congress passes Crockett Bill, historic clampdown on drug price gouging. Jasmine Crockett's legacy begins, with legislation that changes everything. But the real response wasn't in the headlines. It was in the letters pouring into her office. A single mother from Detroit wrote, "For the first time in years, I filled a prescription and didn't cry in the parking lot." A Vietnam veteran from Texas wrote, "I buried my wife because we couldn't afford another round of chemo. Thank you for making sure no one else has to make that decision." Doctors sent messages of relief. Pharmacies prepared for change. And Wall Street, it adjusted. Because no market, no matter how large, was bigger than a government finally remembering who it serves. And through it all, Jasmine remained steady. She didn't revel in victory. She returned to her desk, her notes, her next challenge. Because this bill, powerful as it was only the first line in a much longer fight. One law couldn't undo decades of quiet exploitation, but it could end the lie that nothing could be done. It could prove that one hearing, one voice, one act of courage was enough to break the silence. And as the sun set over the Capitol dome that evening, the nation didn't just celebrate a vote. It remembered who justice looks like when it stands tall, tells the truth, and writes the law. The Crockett Bill had become law, but its impact was rippling far beyond American borders. And soon, the woman who had stood alone in a storm of corporate power would take the world stage. This time not to fight, but to lead. Geneva, Switzerland. The iconic marble hall of the World Health Organization was filled wall to wall. Health ministers, global CEOs, activists, journalists, and public servants from over 90 countries. But on this day, every seat faced one podium, and every conversation circled one name: Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Invited as the keynote speaker at the WHO Global Ethics Summit, she wasn't there as a politician. She was there as a symbol of accountability, of defiance, of moral clarity in a system that had long confused profit with progress. Her face had appeared on magazine covers, but she wore no designer suit, no practiced smile. She stepped to the lectern in the same calm, grounded presence she had carried through every hearing, every attack, every silence that begged to be broken. The room quieted, not out of protocol, but anticipation. Cameras flickered. Jasmine looked out, not at celebrities or CEOs, but at people who had spent years fighting the same battles she had fought in Washington. The war between access and exploitation, between need and greed. She opened her remarks not with data, not with titles, but with a name. Elijah, the 13-year-old boy from the video shown in Congress, the child who had become a face of what unchecked markets could do to vulnerable lives. In the world's most powerful economy, she said, voice low but unwavering, a child was priced out of survival, and we called that legal. A murmur passed through the crowd, not disagreement, but recognition, because her story wasn't just America's, it was everyone's. She didn't speak in abstractions. She told of mothers skipping meals to buy antibiotics, of clinics in Mississippi closing their doors while biotech CEOs bought third yachts, of patents traded like poker chips across borders while patients begged for expired pills. But what made her words cut deeper than policy papers was their origin. Not from theory, but from proximity. She had sat in those courtrooms. She had stared down the men who turned disease into dividends. Innovation means nothing, she said, if it only travels the roads wealth has paved. Medicine is not medicine if it isn't reachable. Her speech wasn't fiery, it was surgical. And in the tension between every word, she held the room in stillness, not by commanding it, but by telling the truth no one else had dared to center in that building before. Health is not a privilege to be sold. It is a right long overdue to be defended. As she finished, she didn't ask for applause, she asked for commitment. This is not about one country, she said. This is about a species deciding what kind of future it's willing to fund. Because if we allow suffering to remain profitable, we are not curing disease. We are institutionalizing it. For a long second after she stepped away, no one moved. The pause wasn't confusion. It was reverence. Then the room stood, not out of tradition, but because they knew they had just witnessed a moment that would outlive the microphones and the cameras. Outside, press from 6 continents reported it the same way. A quiet revolution had just walked across the WHO stage and left every government in the world with one less excuse. While the world stood to applaud Jasmine Crockett at the World Health Organization in a far quieter corner of the justice system, another verdict was signed, one that didn't need cheers to declare its finality. It came in ink, not thunder, but it stripped away everything Shkreli had ever built his power upon. The ruling was historic. For the first time in modern U.S. legal history, a private citizen was not only prosecuted and punished for corporate fraud, but was permanently banned from holding any intellectual property rights in medicine, biotech, or pharmaceuticals. Not just in name, not just within a company. The ban was comprehensive. Any trademark, formula, patent, or proprietary technology within the health sector, even if developed by someone else, could not bear his signature, ownership, or financial link. The ruling cited willful, repeated exploitation of life-saving therapies for private gain, and a proven pattern of evading regulatory structures through deceit. It was more than a legal sentence. It was a statement to the world that the machinery of exploitation could no longer hide behind innovation. Martin Shkreli, once a rising star of Wall Street biotech, was no longer a tycoon. He was now a cautionary tale codified into law. The enforcement was swift. Within 72 hours, federal agents served writs to dissolve his stake in dormant shell corporations. International patent offices were notified by U.S. trade officials, and on the SEC's public blacklist, his name appeared in bold, barred from future filings. Helix Biocorp's assets were frozen indefinitely. Investigators seized every electronic device linked to his former firms. Consultants and lawyers scrambled to distance themselves. But there was no legal maneuver left. His power, once hidden in layered ownership structures and offshore filings, had been surgically dismantled. And what remained was a name that now opened no doors, inspired no fear, and unlocked no accounts. His new cell was quieter than the last. Smaller. A single window faced a high brick wall. No natural light reached the concrete floor. His access to digital media was limited to a state-curated tablet. No apps, no browsing, only approved video archives and select news bulletins. But it was on that screen, loaded under the Congressional Proceedings category, that the moment of reckoning waited for him. The same clip that had reshaped global healthcare policy, that had gone viral in 26 countries, that had inspired a generation of whistleblowers and physicians to speak, now played on repeat in a silent prison block with no escape. He tapped play. The screen lit up with the image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall behind the microphone in room 2141. Her eyes locked forward, not just at him, but through him. There was no grandstanding, no raised voice, just the sound of something heavier than law, truth stripped of compromise. Getting rich off other people's desperation isn't innovation. It's a licensed form of crime. You didn't build a cure, you built a cage, and you sold the key to the highest bidder. This isn't capitalism. This is cruelty wearing a lab coat. And then the sound he could never forget. Applause. Prolonged, unstoppable, standing ovation. It hadn't come from political allies or partisan crowds. It had come from survivors, mothers, frontline doctors, lifelong skeptics, people who, for the first time, had seen the system speak with a human voice. And it wasn't his. Shkreli sat motionless. The smugness was gone. So was the confidence, the ego, the certainty that loopholes could always be found, that wealth could always outrun justice. In its place was silence, a silence so absolute it seemed to press in from the walls. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of understanding, the kind that sinks in only when there is no more spin, no more audience, no more distance from consequence. He played the clip again and again. Each time, he watched Jasmine deliver the same line with the same unshakable clarity. Each time the applause rose at the end. Each time he had to sit with the knowledge that the world didn't just reject him, it had recalibrated around what he had revealed. He wasn't the innovator. He was the infection. And she had been the diagnosis the system refused to delay any longer. Elsewhere, the Crockett bill had already begun saving lives. Drug manufacturers rewrote pricing models. Insurance companies adjusted coverage rates. A global summit was planned to create international standards using the language she had forged in that hearing room. And for the first time, nations from every region were citing a single American voice, not as an academic, not as a diplomat, but as the woman who called cruelty what it was and gave the world permission to do the same. Back in the cell, Shkreli stared at the tablet as the clip played for the fifth time. But this time, he didn't look angry. He didn't even blink. His hands sat in his lap, palms open, because he knew. The business empire, the clever games, the illusion of invincibility, they were gone. What remained was a permanent stain on the system's memory, and a single voice that would forever stand as the one he couldn't outtalk, outrun, or outlast. Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the mask, and justice at last had a face. The screen dimmed. The clip stopped. And in the sterile stillness of a federal cell in Virginia, Martin Shkreli sat frozen, not in fear, but in recognition. Recognition that the world outside had moved on, that everything he once built on arrogance and loopholes had collapsed not with a gunshot or a raid, but with a voice, Jasmine Crockett's voice. And now that voice no longer echoed in a courtroom. It resonated in global policy. Outside the prison walls, a movement was unfolding, quietly, steadily, unstoppably. The Crockett Bill, once doubted, debated, and resisted, had taken root not only in American law, but in the very language of international health reform. Less than a year after its passage, parliaments in over a dozen countries were reviewing sister legislation, some word for word. The European Parliament introduced Crockett clauses into its Drug Price Equity Act. The Canadian Ministry of Health, long mired in negotiations with private distributors, pointed to the U.S. framework as proof that bold policy was not only possible, but necessary. In São Paulo, protesters outside a hospital held signs in Portuguese that translated simply to, Don't price us out. Crockett showed the way. But while others celebrated, Jasmine did not. She refused interviews on primetime shows, declined invitations to ribbon cuttings, keynote dinners, and Sunday morning panels. When a prestigious media outlet named her the conscience of Capitol Hill, she sent back a handwritten reply that read only, "Justice isn't a headline." While the world built monuments, she went home. To Dallas, then Detroit, then Jackson. Not to pose for photos, but to listen. To return to the rooms where suffering had once spoken in whispers. In Detroit, she sat with pharmacists in a break room behind a store where, not long ago, they'd had to choose between stocking EpiPens or keeping the lights on. They didn't ask for policy updates. They just said thank you and offered her a folding chair. In Mississippi, she visited a single mother whose teenage son now had daily access to a rare immune-boosting drug that had once cost $400 a vial. There was no press, no statement, just Jasmine sitting quietly on a worn couch, listening as a woman cried not out of pain, but relief. These weren't campaign stops. These were repairs. Quiet acts of restoration in the places policy had ignored for decades. Jasmine didn't treat them like victories. She treated them like obligations. Change that's real doesn't end with applause, she told her staff. It ends when people don't have to beg for what should have always been theirs. Still, the world refused to forget her. Her speech at the WHO was transcribed in 24 languages. Schools across Europe added her name to global ethics curricula. Medical students in Nairobi recited her quote during a demonstration. Health isn't innovation until it's accessible. In London, her testimony was used in the drafting of new public health procurement contracts. And back in the US, a growing number of law schools added the Crockett Bill to their coursework, not as a case study, but as a precedent, under a new section titled Functional Ethics in Crisis Governance. But Jasmine resisted canonization. When a bipartisan congressional delegation proposed naming a new federal pharmaceutical oversight body in her honor, she hesitated. The vote passed. The Jasmine Crockett Center for Pharmaceutical Equity. She skipped the ribbon cutting. Instead, she sent a recorded message. It lasted just 17 seconds. Justice, she said, isn't something you hold. It's something you hand forward. And it was being handed forward. In Rwanda, a hospital director wrote to say a rural clinic used her hearing footage to pressure distributors into cutting prices. In Manila, a nurses' union held a vigil for patients lost to pricing hikes and ended it by declaring Jasmine an honorary member. In rural Alabama, a health administrator started a scholarship in her name for students studying health law. Back in Washington, something quieter was happening. The stories had changed. For years, congressional staffers had gotten letters filled with desperation, pleas from patients who couldn't afford insulin, seizure medication, chemotherapy. Now they were getting new letters from patients who could, from parents who had found a full month of refills on the shelf for the first time in years, from elderly couples who could finally afford both groceries and medicine in the same week. Advocacy groups began to track the results, a 43% drop in catastrophic pricing incidents across the country. Dozens of rural hospitals, once weeks away from closure, began reporting financial stabilization. Pharmacies in low-income ZIP codes stopped rationing basic supplies. On the one-year anniversary of the hearing, there were no parades, no interviews, no commemorative pins. But in Brooklyn, a mural appeared overnight on the side of an abandoned urgent care clinic. It showed Jasmine, her face half-shadowed, standing tall, not triumphant, resolute. Around her were not politicians, not celebrities, but names. Names of real people, cancer survivors, diabetic patients, sickle cell warriors. Names of those who had written her, fought beside her, lived because of her. Across the top were 5 words, spray-painted in stark white. She listened. Then she changed everything. Back in her office, Jasmine stared at a copy of that mural taped to the inside of her drawer. No fanfare, no caption, just the image and the memory of how it all began. Not with a viral moment, not even with a bill, but with a chair in a courtroom, a child on a screen, and the decision to speak a sentence no one had dared to say aloud. And in that silence, the one that came after the applause, after the hearings, after the headlines, the real legacy began. Not carved in stone, but in prescription labels, clinic doors reopened, and the breath of a 13-year-old boy who no longer had to wait. Time passed. The headlines faded. The hearings gave way to new legislative cycles. But some names lingered longer than others, etched into memory not by fame, but by consequence. Martin Shkreli's name was not one of them. What once had been a symbol of bold arrogance, quoted in finance podcasts, idolized in certain corners of Silicon Valley as brilliant disruption, was now disappearing from public life. One server, one archive, one syllabus at a time. He was not martyred. He was not mythologized. He was deleted. It started quietly. Universities removed his case from strategy modules and reclassified it under predatory conduct. Business schools that had once taught his pricing model as a case study in market leverage now issued formal apologies to patient advocacy groups. At one institution, a professor who once called him cold but correct was forced to step down after student protest. Textbooks changed. Footnotes were rewritten. Entire chapters collapsed into a single line. This practice was outlawed under the Crockett Act of 2026. Then came the legal removals. Government procurement blacklists, civil forfeitures. Every LLC, trust, and silent partner agreement linked to Shkreli was scrubbed from active pharmaceutical records. International trade regulators placed lifetime bans on his participation in drug licensing. And in the ultimate irony, the patents he once hoarded like trophies, patents that gave him the power to raise prices by 5,000% overnight, were redistributed under public access clauses. Hospitals now used his former assets not to profit, but to heal. In the prison system, Shkreli faded into routine. Inmates called him the medicine guy with no trace of awe. He was denied access to private visitors. His attempts to publish commentary were intercepted and blocked. The last blog post he'd ever written was flagged for misinformation. Even his old Twitter accounts, once buzzing with sarcastic jabs, were permanently suspended. The final image most people remembered was a still frame from the congressional hearing. Jasmine Crockett staring him down, the words licensed crime frozen in subtitles beneath her. And while his name was being erased, hers was being carved, quietly, deliberately, into stone. Washington, D.C., late autumn. The morning was overcast when the crowd gathered just beyond the Capitol reflecting pool. No pomp, no security lines. Just folding chairs, a modest podium, and a tarp-covered statue. The attendees weren't dignitaries. They were nurses, pharmacists, teachers, former patients, parents who had once been told that survival came second to cost. They didn't bring press kits. They brought prescription bottles with labels that no longer bankrupted them. When the tarp was pulled back, the figure beneath wasn't grandiose. It wasn't marble or gold. It was cast in weathered bronze. Jasmine Crockett standing at a lectern, left hand holding a slim binder, right hand extended, not as a gesture of power, but of insistence. Her eyes weren't cast downward in humility or upward in hope. They were level, staring straight ahead. Beneath the statue, the inscription read, Jasmine Crockett, truth is the law that fear cannot silence. In memory of every voice raised too late, in honor of the ones who raised it in time. Jasmine didn't attend the ceremony. She watched it from a small office in Houston, where she was consulting on a new bill targeting medical debt collection. Her team offered to host a live-stream Q&A. She declined. Instead, she sent a single message to be read aloud at the unveiling. If a name is worth remembering, let it be because it made someone else's life less impossible. The crowd stood in silence after the message was read. Some cried, not out of grief, but out of the strange, unfamiliar feeling that the system had, for once, chosen someone who actually deserved the pedestal. And yet Jasmine never stopped. A week later, she appeared unannounced at a rural clinic in West Virginia that had just reopened after years of closure. No press followed her. No mayor met her. She simply walked in, asked how they were managing under the new pricing reforms, and took notes. She returned to her hotel alone, typed up a report for a Senate subcommittee, and declined an interview with a major network. Policy, she once said, should never have a publicist. Meanwhile, in a small federal correctional facility, Martin Shkreli received the monthly news bulletin provided to inmates. On page 3, under Public Policy Highlights, was a photo of the statue. The image was cropped, the resolution low, but the posture was unmistakable. He stared at it for several minutes, then turned the page, then stared again. The caption under the photo read, "Capitol Honors Representative, Jasmine Crockett for legislative courage and medical ethics reform." He didn't speak. He didn't curse. He didn't throw the bulletin across the room. He folded it, carefully, neatly, placed it back on the metal desk. Because even he knew this was permanent. No media outlet would quote him again. No investor would return his calls. His name would never be attached to a cure, a discovery, or a company ticker. The only name that would survive the moment, the only one etched into court records, legislative history, and the skin of a bronze statue, was hers. And in a world finally learning the difference between genius and harm, that was enough. Long after the hearings ended, after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines moved on, one truth remained, etched deeper than any law or statue. This wasn't just a political reckoning. It was a human one. And with it came a lesson the world could no longer afford to ignore. The real battle wasn't fought in marble buildings or under the glow of TV cameras. It was fought in doctors' offices where mothers clutched expired prescriptions. In back rooms of pharmacies where staff debated which patients could get their meds and which would walk away empty-handed. In hospital corridors where men in suits justified suffering as economic consequence. That was the battlefield Jasmine Crockett stepped into. Not with fury, but with clarity. Not because she wanted to become a symbol, but because someone had to say what the system refused to admit, that we had built an empire on pain and called it progress. What she faced wasn't just Shkreli's smirk or corporate greed. It was a structure designed to strip humanity from numbers until no one remembered what those numbers stood for. And she stood again and again against the tide of that machine, not to be righteous, but to remind us all that dignity should never be sold in monthly installments. The human lesson buried in the courtroom transcript is this: we normalized cruelty. We let price tags determine who lived and who didn't. We let innovation mean exclusive, let access mean optional. In the name of profit, we turned survival into a transaction and convinced ourselves that competition made the system stronger, even if it left our neighbors weaker. Shkreli wasn't an anomaly. He was a mirror, and Jasmine forced the country to look into it. She showed us that we had mistaken loopholes for intelligence, extraction for excellence. Her confrontation wasn't just against a man, it was against the story we kept telling ourselves to avoid responsibility. And when she broke it open, piece by piece, what spilled out wasn't just corruption, it was complicity. Ours. But there was another truth. One harder to accept, but more powerful. It didn't have to stay that way. One voice sharpened by principle, backed by evidence, and driven by the quiet fury of lived reality, can start an avalanche. Jasmine proved that policy doesn't have to be numb, that courage doesn't have to scream to be seismic. Her strength wasn't just in how she dismantled lies. It was in how she made space for truths that had been whispered, dismissed, and buried. In a world obsessed with noise, she made silence meaningful. She showed that justice isn't always a hammer. Sometimes it's a mirror held steady long enough for the world to see itself and choose something better. And what the world saw, when it finally looked, was a system built upside down, where pharmaceutical empires could rise while children died waiting, where lobbyists could craft exceptions while nurses worked double shifts, where the word ethics was stamped on strategy decks but never on supply chains. Jasmine forced that system to answer to the one thing it was never prepared to face: accountability measured in human cost. And when she spoke, when she called exploitation a licensed form of crime, it wasn't just a line. It was a line drawn in the sand, a moral boundary that said, from this point on, we name the harm, we trace its architect, and we fight for those who never had the podium to begin with. If there is a lesson to be remembered, it is this: change doesn't come when it's convenient. It comes when someone decides that comfort can no longer be prioritized over conscience. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for consensus. She created it. She didn't wait for permission. She spoke until silence had nowhere left to hide. Her story isn't one of perfection. It's one of precision, of showing up, of staying when the cameras left, of fighting when the system tried to shame her into silence. And that's the most human lesson of all, that every injustice persists until someone chooses not to look away. So remember this. The next time a system says, it's just business, ask, at whose expense? The next time a voice like Jasmine's speaks into the storm, don't wait for the wind to stop. Listen, because the stories we tell about justice are only as strong as the people willing to live them out when it costs everything to do so. And if one voice can break a silence this loud, then what excuse do the rest of us have? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.